So this is the panel on the Taylor rule at 30, celebrating John's discretion versus policy rules in practice 1993 paper. Disclaimer, John didn't want us to do this. This was Mike Bordeaux's idea, my enthusiastic second, and John's reluctant, okay, if you guys really have to. John's a very modest guy, but we can't not celebrate this moment. John, what is the Taylor rule? Interest rates should rise about 1.5% with inflation and about half with the output gap. This idea, of course, had precursors. Wicksell wrote a German book in the 1890s with something like that idea in it in very complicated German prose. The Bank of England had for centuries been raising interest rates to defend the gold standard. It was in technical things in the 1980s by John as well as some others. But this paper is what really made it important and brought it to life. Why? What's important about the Taylor rule? First, the universal doctrine up to that point was that the central bank cannot and should not target interest rates. Friedman's famous 1968 AEA address said, no, an interest rate target, the economy will blow up, it's unstable. Target money growth. Sergeant Wallace in 1975, an interest rate target will lead to indeterminacy, sunspots, multiple equilibria. Target money growth instead. But the Fed doesn't target money growth. It targets interest rates. That's nice. How does our world work? Well, the Taylor rule, raising interest rates with inflation, leads to, in these theories, a economy that is both stable and determinate. It's the central innovation that you need to have any theory that is able to talk about central banks that target interest rates, which our central banks do. So it's a great theoretical advance. It's also empirical. Now, this John's paper was primarily about empirical work. John and many others, we have Rich here, who wrote a very famous paper showing that when the Fed started following a Taylor rule in the 1980s, the inflation got much, much better. And that's a fact repeated many times. In 1993, John's work really brought it from theory and from empirical characterization to a prescription. Not just this is how the Fed has behaved when times have been good, but how the Fed should behave. A great feature of the Taylor rule is that it is robust. You don't just take a model and say the Taylor rule is the right thing to do. In fact, it's not optimal in most models. Most models have complicated optimal rules, but it's pretty darn good in all models. Old-fashioned ISLM models, it's pretty darn good. New Keynesian rational expectations models, totally different models, it's still pretty darn good for totally different reason. I do fiscal theory of the price level, a third category of model. Guess what? Though it's a totally different model, the Taylor rule is pretty darn good. In fact, close to optimal in that model too. Is the Taylor rule a rule? Well, it's sort of a rule and sort of not a rule. One of the great calumnies that John has to fight against every day and for 30 years is that he says, oh, you just replace the Fed with a computer. Well, no. And as one of the things John has continued to say, and one of his most important roles in interpreting and understanding this, is it's not a mechanical rule, it's a strategy. It's the benchmark. It gives you accountability, it gives you communication. But yes, it is a rule, in that it's there to help guide expectations. What we all understand is that inflation is maintained when people know what to expect of the Fed, of the economy. We live, I think this is the general point Condi was just saying, if we live in a society, stable institutions, and know what to expect of the future, things are much better today. So it is a rule in that sense. It replaces a money growth rule or a gold standard as a way of telling people over the long run, what is it we're going to do? It's also a pre-commitment. Milton Friedman had the great analogy of a shower, where you turn on the water and it gets too hot, then you turn it off and it gets too cold. That's discretion. And a lot of John's point was rules rather than discretion are a rule in the sense they pre-commit the Fed to do things that it might not want to do ex post. A rule is like the mandate. You know, the Fed has a mandate, output inflation, which happens to be the things in the Taylor rule. A mandate also tells you not just the things you should pay attention to, but all the things you shouldn't pay attention to. And that's what the Taylor rule does too. It is, of course, amazingly influential, and that's why we're here. The Taylor rule is at the heart of all monetary economics that talks about central banks with interest rate targets, which is how our central banks do things. It's at the heart of all our current understanding and doctrines of how central banks should operate when they're doing things well, and we come together once a year to remind central banks of that fact. And here we are again today. So with that preamble, let's go. I think I'll take it in the order we've got here. Rich, why don't you go next, and then John, and then Volker.
Well, thank you. You know, John Cochran's always a tough act to follow, but especially now since my comments have a correlation coefficient about 0.8 with his. But I've got 15 minutes and not one, so maybe I'll put some meat on the bones here. Well, it's really a privilege to participate once again in the annual Hoover Monetary Policy Conference. I've not been to all 13, but I think I've been to 9 or 10. And it's always a must on my calendar each year. The theme of this year's conference is especially timely given the sharp, hawkish policy pivot since last year's Hoover conference by the Fed and other major central banks as they've tried to get back on track and ahead of the curve after presiding over the sharpest sustained surge in inflation in 40 years. Now, I will have something to say towards the end of my remarks about recent events, and specifically the get back to where you once belonged theme. But my welcome assignment on this panel is to offer some thoughts on the Taylor rule at 30, and I'm honored and humbled to do so. When John called me in March to extend the invitation, I, of course, accepted on the spot, but being an economist, I also recognized that writing a paper and preparing remarks for a 15-minute presentation on the Taylor rule at 30 would of necessity be an exercise in constrained optimization. After all, that's less than 30 seconds a year. It then occurred to me that I could perhaps organize my remarks not by chronology, but instead by the many extensions of the original Taylor rule paper that have been developed over the past 30 years and applied across a number of fields of economics, including but not confined to monetary theory, macroeconometrics, international finance, asset pricing, and yes, the fiscal theory of the price level. But of course, the influence of the Taylor rule paper on each of these literatures is vast. The paper, after all, does have 13,000 Google Scholar citations, and has stimulated so many papers and books that I simply will not be able to survey today. And so instead, I will, if you will permit me, draw on my remarks and papers presented at previous Hoover conferences to offer a certainly selective and unabashedly personal 30,000-foot perspective on the Taylor rule at 30. Let me set the stage, as did John, with a very brief review of the evolution over the past 60 years of professional thinking about monetary policy. And here I will draw on the remarks I presented at the Hoover conference in 2019. And as with most things in monetary economics, I begin with Milton Friedman and the AEA presidential address, The Role of Monetary Policy. The article is, of course, most famous for its message that there is no long-run exploitable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And in the paper, Friedman introduced the concept of the natural rate of unemployment, U star. What's less widely appreciated, except among folks in this room, but in the profession, is that the article also contains a concise but very insightful discussion of the Vixelian natural rate of interest. And as I emphasized in my remarks here in 2019, while U star and R star provide key reference points in Friedman's framework for assessing how far the economy is from its long-run equilibrium, they play absolutely no role in the monetary policy rule he advocates, his well-known K% rule. So the basic point in Friedman is that U star and R star are destinations, but they're not inputs to the policy rule. Of course, I don't need to elaborate for this audience that the history of K% rules is that they were rarely tried, and when they were tried in the 70s and 80s, they were found to work much better in theory and practice. Velocity relationships broke down, the money multiplier was a random variable. And in particular, the macroeconomic priority beginning in the late 70s and the 80s in the US, the UK, and other major economies was to do whatever it takes to break the back of inflation and restore the credibility of central banks squandered by the decade of the 70s and the inflation in that decade. Now, by the early 1990s, thanks to Paul Volcker, inflation had been broken, and thanks to Alan Greenspan, the conditions for price stability had been achieved. And in retrospect, I think it's clear, and for those of us who are working in research, that the time was right for something to fill what was a real vacuum. This is not a small point. Inflation's now sort of a low number, and the idea is, how do you preserve that progress? And there was really a vacuum because folks had given up on K% rules. So although it was mostly unspoken, there was a growing sense at the time that a simple systematic framework, really a strategy for central bank practice, was really needed. And the vacuum, of course, was filled by John in the classic 1993 paper, Discretion versus Policy Rule and Practice. John Cochran's always emphasized the enormous influence and importance of this paper, and I'll give you some particular examples. But for the purposes today, I'll note that for the crucial insight of John's paper is that whereas a central bank could pick the K in a K% rule on its own, a well-designed policy rule for setting short-term rates should argue several requirements. First, the rule should anchor the nominal policy rate at a level equal to the sum of its estimate of the neutral rate and the inflation target. And of course, John's paper was written really before formal inflation targeting was adopted, but in essence, it was a strategy for achieving an inflation target. Second, to achieve the nominal anchor, the central bank should be prepared to raise the policy rate by more than 1-for-1 with the inflation rate. And that's really the key result. And John referred to Sargent and Wallace and Friedman itself for stability. And then finally, of course, central banks in the Taylor rule not only adjust policy with respect to R star, but also some measure of potential output. The Taylor approach to instrument rule specification has been found to produce good macroeconomic outcomes across a wide range of models. ISLM, DSGE, in both open and closed economies, certainly something I worked on with Gertler and Galley, was to show the Taylor principle broadly as a good anchor for thinking about open economy monetary policy. Moreover, what's really interesting is that Taylor rules, as John said, are robust. They work pretty well in almost any macro model that you can write down, which is in itself quite an achievement. Now, I said that the information requirements to deploy a Taylor rule are modest, but they're not minimal. And I think this comes up in practice, in particular, getting the R star right. Interestingly enough, I think you can get by without knowing too much about U star, but getting R star right is important, and I'll come back to that in an end. Another feature, maybe more appealing to wonks than to central bankers, although sometimes the two are the same, is that putting the Taylor rule in a macro model will typically rule out multiple equilibria, and policymakers may not understand it, but they do know that they don't like it. So being able to tell someone that if you do this, you will rule out multiple equilibrium is reassuring. They're also found to be learnable, and this was Jim Bullard's important contribution. That is, suppose people start off, they don't even know the model, but the central bank says it's following a Taylor rule. Eventually, by doing sensible things, they'll eventually learn the model, and that's also a very important result. Now, some of my own research on what it means for monetary policy to be data dependent, I've studied a DSGE plus Taylor rule setup where the central bank and agents don't know potential output, and they're trying to learn about it over time. The little twist here is that potential output is infrequently subject to a regime change. You can be productive or less productive. And with this simple structure, the Taylor rule does pretty darn well. Although in these models, interestingly enough, you never converge. There's always perpetual learning because you can always get this regime change. And one feature of this model is that overconfidence on the part of the central banker is very costly. And in this model, that means that if the real world can switch between high and low productivity, but the central banker ignores the switch as a possibility, it can lead to really, really bad outcomes. Now, John's original paper was an exercise in positive as well as normative economics, and if we can advance the slide, was an exercise in positive as well as normative economics that not only wrote down what a good policy rule should look like, it made the case that Fed policy during the Greenspan disinflation more or less tracked such a rule. And this is, just the cut and paste from the original paper. John's original formulation of the Taylor rule assumed that R star was equal to 2 and that the Fed should be able to keep inflation at 2. Now, this was, of course, nearly 20 years before the Fed adopted a formal inflation target at 2%, and at a time in 1993 when U.S. inflation had last printed 2% decades before. I've done this calculation, and John, I don't know if you've seen it, it's really striking. In the 15 years after the Taylor rule paper was published, U.S. inflation averaged 2, the funds rate averaged 4, and the real rate averaged 2%. I think sometimes they say in baseball you'd rather be lucky than good, but I think that's pretty good. Now, the finding that a Taylor rule could account for Fed policy during the Greenspan years spawned its own research agenda to formulate and try to identify in time series data empirical Taylor type rules that could account for broad swings in policy rates in the US, Europe, and Japan. And this is something that I worked on in the 90s with Gertler and Galley. This literature also embedded a version of a Taylor rule, a forward-looking Taylor rule, where you set policy based on expected inflation. And embedded those into a VAR framework. And in particular, if policy is a function of expected inflation, and expected inflation in a VAR is just some linear function of n variables with m lags, then the policy rate will appear to be a function of those n variables and m lags. And it may just look like a kitchen sink. But upon further reflection, it's actually telling you something. It's saying anything that helps to forecast inflation should influence policy, but in a disciplined way. You don't have the choice of what goes in the kitchen sink. You have to use that data in a particular way. And so the Taylor rule puts discipline on central bank reaction functions in a very, very powerful and pretty unrelenting way. Here's a chart from one of my early papers with Gertler and Galley, where we just took a Taylor rule and did the forward-looking form. And what you will see here is basically a pretty darn good fit to actual policy. You also see in the 70s, the bad old days, they really were the bad old days. Let's see where I am now. I vividly recall presenting an early version of this work at the Bundesbank in 1996 with Ottmar Issing in the audience. And when I asked Ottmar if the Bundesbank, which at the time still publicly communicated policy using the quantity theory, when I asked Ottmar if really they were formulating policy with a Taylor rule, Ottmar replied, and I've confirmed this with him, he doesn't deny, quote, "I won't concede it, but I don't dispute it." And this was in 1996. Now, the fact that Taylor rules can, away from the zero bound, empirically help to account for the mapping from macro data to policy rates means that they can be essential inputs into any asset pricing models of yield curves and currencies, both in academia and fixed income markets. Indeed, I first became aware of John's 1993 paper not from an economics professor, but from a bond trader who was using it to build yield curve models for Citibank. After all, bond yields reflect the expected path of short-term interest rates. And if central banks set rates based on a Taylor rule, then bond yields will embed the joint dynamics of inflation, and the output gap is filtered by the Taylor rule. And this was the key insight of Ang and Piazzesi in 2000. Now, the same is true for exchange rates. Real exchange rates in part reflect expected real rate differentials, and if real interest rate differentials are driven by Taylor rule dynamics, then they will also drive exchange rates. And this was the focus of my work, and Engel and West in particular. So in sum, Taylor rules are today ubiquitous in any economics literature in which macro factors and asset prices are objects of interest. In my remaining moments, I would like to turn from theory and econometrics to policy and practice. And in my experience, Taylor-type rules are ubiquitous, at least in the briefing books that staffs prepare for Fed officials ahead of each monetary policy meeting, and are usually, but not always, but I'm glad to say now back and featured in the Fed's semi-annual monetary policy report. Recent really interesting research by Papel and Pradhan suggests a straightforward way that policy rules could be added to the SEP projections itself. The next shows you how this would have worked in the March 2023 SEP using the inertial form of Taylor rules that are favored by many policy makers. So the black dash line here is what the Fed actually did. The red line is an inertial Taylor rule. and the blue dash is the first cousin of the inertial Taylor rule, an inertial balanced approach Taylor rule that puts a slightly bigger weight on the output gap. Now, it's important to note in this chart how policy paths are constructed. At each calendar date before 2023 Q1, the policy rule paths are computed using actual macro data available at the time, as well as model consistent values for the lag policy rate in the inertial rule. As I explained at last year's Hoover conference, and as evidence from the figure, monetary policy rules were highlighting by the fall of 2021 that liftoff from the ELB was warranted. In the event, the FOMC did begin to pivot in the fall of 2021. We got tapering, we got the end of QE, we got the first rate hike in March, we got QT in June, and then we got a very accelerated liftoff in rates beginning with the June meeting. What I will say about this, as my time is running up, is that the committee had also put forward some guidance about lifting off in August of 2020, focusing on reaching inflation and unemployment goals, and those criteria had actually been met by December of 2021, so just 3 months after the Taylor rule. So I've more than exhausted my 15 minutes, and so let me simply offer a hearty happy birthday to the Taylor rule at 30, and I look forward to hearing from the other presenters and our conversation. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be back here for this terrific conference, and I'm particularly happy to be taking part in this opening session, and that way I'll be able to relax and pay close attention the rest of the day rather than worry about my upcoming presentation. I'm honored to be included in such a great panel on a topic that is particularly important to me, that is the Taylor rule, on the occasion of its 30th anniversary, although I think that birthday would be more appropriate for a title for this session. Time is short, and given the skill and seriousness of my fellow panelists, I knew I could count on them for some pretty heavy-duty considerations of the theory and practice of the Taylor rule. So I'm going to restrict my opening remarks to addressing a few critical but burning questions, and ones that I know that you have been wondering about for some time. First, how did the Taylor rule get its name? Second, how did a modest proposal contained in a paper delivered at an academic conference become known worldwide almost instantaneously? And third, not to miss the important things, what the hell happened to Solomon Brothers, and what did the Taylor rule have to do with it? Okay, taking the first issue first, the Taylor rule and its name. My guess is that you've never thought about this, and even if you did, you would conclude that, of course, John Taylor concocted it, so why wouldn't it be called the Taylor rule? But then you probably never wondered why everyone calls transparent cellophane adhesive tape Scotch tape, or why facial tissues are referred to everywhere as Kleenex. And it turns out that Scotch tape was developed by a fellow named Richard Drew, who allegedly had Scotch bosses. And let me tell you, you don't really want to know the advertising logic that went into naming the brand Kleenex. But think about it. All of you who know John Taylor, and I presume that's pretty much all of us, know him well enough to be sure that he's about the last person on earth who would have named the Taylor rule the Taylor rule. Not his style, to say the least. So here's the original, and I don't know if any of you attended the Carnegie Mellon conference where it was first presented or read it when it was first published. Note the historical aspect of this cover page. The Center for Economic Policy Research at 100 Encina Commons. Yep, that's the predecessor of today's Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, or the current CEPR, housed comfortably in the wonderful Gunn building just across the way. Like Hoover, like Stanford, and like Silicon Valley, CEPR's come a long way from then. Now, I did not attend the Carnegie Mellon conference where the paper was presented, but I did read the paper when it was first published by CEPR. At the time, I was the newly appointed chief economist of Solomon Brothers. To me, the monetary policy rule contained in the paper was, to mix metaphors, music to my ears. My Solomon economic research colleagues and I were convinced that the Federal Reserve's policy had veered off course by failing to tighten policy during the course of 1993, and Taylor's policy rule formulation provided another arrow for our quiver. And here's a graph that shows the Taylor rule. This is an Atlanta Fed version against the actual funds rate, and you can see in 1992 that it had fallen way behind, and then eventually veered to the other side. Here you can see one formulation of the rule arrayed in contrast to the actual funds rate. We made this argument a centerpiece of our annual forecast document, Prospects for Financial Markets, published in December 1993 with the title, Keeping Inflation Low in the 1990s. Here you can see our text. You're not expected to read this. Here you can see the text making the claim that the Fed had veered off course, citing John's article, highlighting, quote, a recent study indicating that until last year, the Fed's policy actions were consistent with an implicit 2% inflation target, but that its failure to hike rates during the past year has called into question the stringency of the Fed's policy goals. And we footnoted the Carnegie Mellon paper. As far as we can ascertain, this is the first independent reference to John's paper, at least outside of an academic context. Also, while the funds rate at the time was about 3%, we calculated that it would be consistent with a rate about 4.125% or so, utilizing the formulation in the conference paper. Now, the next stop in this story is Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan's congressional testimony of January 31st, 1994. Don't worry, you're not expected to even read that. Suffice it to say that what we at Solomon Economic Research heard the chair say was, we are going to hike rates and we are going to begin any minute now. The press reports, as were typical of the time, reveled in telling everyone that you can never make head nor tail out of the chairman's Delphic remarks. At Solomon Brothers, however, my colleagues and I virtually ran around the trading floor yelling, the Fed is coming, the Fed is coming. Well, the Fed acted by hiking the funds rate by 25 basis points on February 4th, beginning a tightening cycle that would extend until February 1995. Here you can see, encompassing a rise in the funds rate from 3% to 6%, and including in November 94, a hike of 75 basis points. In other words, using the Taylor calculation, the Fed went from too loose to too tight in the space of about 1 year. Parenthetically, the core PCE deflator was about 2.25% in January 94, and about the same rate a year later. Even more unnerving, at least for financial market participants, was the accompanying bond market rout. When Chair Greenspan spoke on January 31st, the 10-year Treasury bond yield was 5.94%. It peaked in October 31st at 8.04%. In fact, precedent would have suggested that the first 50 basis points of tightening by the Fed would have produced a bond yield back of about half that magnitude, or about 25 basis points. In 1994, in contrast, 10-year bond yields backed up by nearly a full percentage point in response to the first 50 basis points rise in the funds rate. Traders' lack of experience with a tightening environment in the context of large holdings of mortgage-backed securities and their negative convexity set off an unexpected wave of Treasury bond selling by traders seeking to control their duration risk, a factor that was almost totally unanticipated. So my Solomon Brothers economic research colleagues and I eventually became convinced that the Fed had overdone the tightening and that the bond market sell-off also was overdone. In the meantime, however, Solomon Brothers trading desk, especially the mortgage-backed security trading desk, had lost copious amounts of money, maybe as much as $1 billion on a mark-to-market basis. That was real money back in those days. We Solomon Brothers analysts were mortified to realize that the traders simply hadn't believed our Fed analysis and were unprepared for the bond market consequences. I'm going to return to that theme in a few minutes. As we subsequently built our case with regard to both Fed policy and bond market valuations, my colleague Bob DiClemente reminded me recently that we made our arguments based on comparing the actual funds rate to a neutral or hypothetical equilibrium rate, and each time we footnoted the John Carnegie Mellon paper. In making client presentations, we routinely would include what came to be called Taylor rule calculations. Finally, in mid-1995, we decided to summarize the burgeoning discussion on monetary policy rules in a compact form for our clients. The result was this publication, Policy Rules Shed New Light on Fed Stance, published in June 1995, in which we introduced the topic in a generic fashion and highlighted a list of policy rules. You don't have to read all that, but there were a bunch. And of course, we gave pride of place to John Taylor and his rule. We then went on to emphasize the usefulness of what we called Taylor's rule. And so far as we know, this was the first use of this personalized nomenclature. So if you understood, I just modestly claimed. Okay. All right. Moving now to the second question. So why did the Taylor rule's fame spread so far and so fast? Well, taking one lesson from investment banking, the right deal at the right time at the right place will be snapped up in a flash. I think, and at the time probably hoped, that Salomon Brothers economic research had attracted some attention with our vindicated call on the Fed's belated tightening, this despite our traders' failure to believe us. And we then spent a fair amount of time in '94 arguing that the Fed was overdoing it, as was the Treasury market. So perhaps we gained a bit of street credibility, having called it both ways, as it were. And we consistently referred to the Taylor rule, by now using this name, as providing useful guidance. In any case, other Wall Street economists quickly followed suit, that is, in utilizing the Taylor rule as a basis for their analysis. And they, and journalists, and eventually even some academics, persistently queried central bankers to defend or explain their policy moves or lack of same by reference to the Taylor rule. Before you know it, virtually everyone, everywhere, was using it, and even some who tended at the time to view its practical usefulness as an artifact of right place, right time, rather than something that would retain validity over time. Even they seem to be coming back to utilizing the tool as a practical policy guide. And as we've just heard from the previous two speakers, one of the characteristics of the Taylor rule is its robustness that has survived, has been demonstrated over the past 30 years. So in investment banking terms, it was the right deal at the right time, and it continues to demonstrate its relevance 30 years on. Oh yes. And what the hell happened to Salomon Brothers? I don't want to waste your time with a detailed story. Suffice it to say that the firm's self-image as the world's preeminent securities trading firm simply didn't survive the 1994 trading losses. Remember that Lou Ranieri, the pioneer of the mortgage-backed bond market, was long gone, and John Merriweather and his proprietary traders, made famous by Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker, were by and large up in Greenwich and London and elsewhere, doing business as long-term capital management, and still, at that time, still convincing investors that they had the Midas touch, at least until they didn't, but that came later. So what followed after the 1994 bond debacle wasn't pretty. Yeah, you get the idea. In 1985, Salomon Brothers CEO John Gutfreund had appeared on the cover of Business Week magazine, then a big deal, as the king of Wall Street. And this when I doubt that the firm totaled more than about 2,500 employees, soup to nuts. 1 decade later, and the firm had run out of gas, as it were, and didn't have a viable long-term strategy, and along came Sandy Weil and Smith Barney, and then Citigroup, and the rest is history. But I like to think, if only the Salomon traders had just paid attention to the message of the Taylor rule, even in its infancy, perhaps they would still be the kings of Wall Street, but we'll never know. So Salomon Brothers is no more, but the Taylor rule lives on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This will be 2 tough acts to follow, so it's only downhill from now. But I'll try to keep it short. And you don't even have to look at me, you can look at the slides. The text will be there. So if I have the time, I will make some remarks first on the rule in the original paper and John's contributions. Also, secondly, on Taylor rules in macro models and policy practice, and trying to apply this to the current situation coming out of Corona with the inflation surge and how to get back on track. So here, again, I also cut out some PDFs from the original PDF, the original paper. And some of us, when you first read a journal article, I mean, not you, I said some of us, maybe first look at the references, right? Seeing who gets cited. Maybe secondly, at footnotes. So this is what I'm going to do. Let's look at the first footnote, and yes, that's me. Volker Wieland, John Williams, Craig Furfine, so we were research assistants at the time, and apparently we did something useful or said something useful, so John actually thanked us. I'm still researching what we actually contributed or what but anyway, so they're not here, John Williams and Craig, so you have to, so you're stuck with me. So sometimes when I talk about the Taylor rule in teaching, students have the impression that this is really an exercise in description, because looking at the paper and Richard had the chart, right, it looks like, well, somebody was trying to fit this, and it's a pretty good fit. And here was the equation, which was already talked about. But actually, this was totally the other way around. If you read the paper, you'll find, here is, I think, the introduction or the abstract. The paper basically examines how recent econometric policy evaluation research on multi-policy rules can be applied in practice. So it's coming from the research on policy evaluation. If you go further down, it says the discussion centers on a hypothetical but representative policy rule, much like that advocated in recent research. So really, this was coming from the research side, from new methods of rational expectations macro, delivering lessons and tools for practical policy, and this is what it says there. And if you look at the next footnote, right, so into the if you look at the next footnote, which is right there, it talks about the Bryant, Hoover, and Mann volume, summarizing a lot of empirical research with large multi-country models, and it talks about a prototype empirical analysis by Taylor 1979, and then a full multi-country analysis described in Taylor 93. So in fact, it was these 2 books here where all the research was, or a lot of this research was brought to a culmination, and that really John put into, motivated him to use this particular rule, which then he found also to fit Fed policy over some time. Now, it's more than that. John actually created the foundations for this research. I mean, if you go back a bit further, Taylor contracts, right? Aggrodynamics and staggered contracts laid foundations for the analysis of real effects of multi-policy and the so-called New Keynesian Phillips curve. Taylor curves actually first came in the 79 Econometrica paper, where he laid out foundations for evaluating in fully general equilibrium models the trade-off between inflation and output and the role of multi-policy. And he even developed the methods, I'm not doing well with the clicking here. That was already there. He even developed the methods together with together with Ray Fair for solving such models, and they're still used today. Now, you've already seen the next chart. So Nobel Prizes have been given. So I don't know, I'm going to embarrass John to the maximum, hopefully. But they've been given for having developed dynamic models for demonstrating, this was Friedman, the complexity of multi-policy, for transforming macroanalysis and deepening our knowledge of economic policy here, Lucas, and for time consistency of policy and research on cause and effect. So I think it's about time to recognize the huge progress that has been made in monetary macro, in the development of foundations for new Keynesian modeling of real effects of multi-policy and rational expectations, and the econometric analysis and design of feedback rules for stabilization policy with a wide impact of policy practice. So personally, I mean, in my humble opinion, there should be a prize for modeling the linkages between the real and monetary sides of the macroeconomy and developing effective rules for stabilization policy. That was my first point. I'm jumping on right away. Taylor rules in macro models and policy practice. So because households and firms are forward-looking, model solution needs to account for the endogenous policy reaction and determine expectations and policy jointly. So that's why it became an essential model, essential element of macro models or feedback rules in general. And since the 1990s, macro models basically, and John Cochrane talked about this, they include rules for monetary policy that respect the Taylor principle, namely that nominal interest rate changes more than 1-for-1 with inflation expectations. And for fiscal policy, so it's not just monetary policy, rules that stabilize debt to GDP ratio. So you actually have monetary dominance in the solution. John emphasized the need for rule-based policy, and basically the objective is to use the power of expectations. There is an expectations channel, and if policy is predictable in those models, it has a huge impact. Now, there are deviations, and deviations have small effects if they are perceived and expected to be temporary. If interest rates themselves have persistence, then the deviations have big effects. So here I'm just comparing two rules, the original Taylor rule and then a version just like what was talked about before with some persistence, here the lagged interest rate and a coefficient of 0.8. And I actually put it back into, so we have on the net a source where you can even find the 93 Taylor multi-country model actually in a linearized version, because of course it was a nonlinear model. So shocking these two rules, deviating from these two rules, and you see of course in the red case the deviation has a longer lasting effect because it gets embedded in the interest rate. And so if you project it forward, just like the chart from David Papel, which I think was a projection of the inertial rule, right? You get that effect in there. And you see that when you look at the effect of this model on the output gap, then of course it has a much larger effect on the output gap. Now, if it was a good deviation, it's a good effect. It was a bad deviation. If it was a bad idea to deviate at the time, of course it has a big effect. So that's the first thing. Now, if you look at the DSGE models developed subsequently, and they were basically matched to VAR evidence, Richard was talking about. Interestingly, they had similar policy effects as in the Taylor 93 model. I mean, that was kind of a surprise. So here we take the Cristiano Eigenbaum-Evans rule. That's a famous paper founding the medium-sized DSGE models, and the rule itself was actually following work by Richard Clarida, and has a 0.8 on the lagged interest rate and then a coefficient on inflation a bit smaller and a bit smaller on the output gap. If you put that into the CEE model, in the famous Metz-Wouters model, and in the original Taylor multi-country model, then you get this here on interest rates and you get this effect on output. So for some magic, the estimated effect under these three models of a policy shock is very similar. Here is about a decline of 35 basis points of GDP in across models, in every model roughly. So at the peak after about 3 quarters or so. You can do that in more models, but the second point, there was a lot of mentioning of robustness. So one example of robustness, if you take these types of rules and try to optimize the coefficients, kind of find coefficients that perform well across models. So one paper I did together with John much later in 2012, we did this averaging over these three models, the Taylor model, the CEE, and the Metz-Wouters model, and just using basically an ad hoc loss function. And you find if you use rules that just have inflation and the output gap, they want to be a bit more aggressive on inflation. If you use rules that include the lagged interest rate, you want to have these first difference rules, basically have a coefficient of 1. So they come out very well in these models which embody rational expectations, but as John Cochrane pointed out earlier, when you include, say, traditional backward-looking models, then these first difference rules would be explosive. in generating explosive dynamics, so they're not quite as robust as if you enlarge the model set. We've already done that with macro-financial models, but I would need more time to talk about that. So I cut that. Moving to policy practice, if you look at the pre-corona menu of the Fed, and I thought that was a great advance to put this in the report and put it in it again. But you see the menu includes the Taylor rule, it includes something with a bigger coefficient on the unemployment gap, right? The Fed is using unemployment instead of output, but in principle, it just doubles the coefficients. But that's another version of the Taylor rule, basically. And then you have the first different rules, which performed well in these forward-looking models or medium DSGE models. You have another version of the Taylor rule, and then you have another version of the Taylor rule with the price level gap. So it's a lot of variations around the Taylor rule, of basically sensible variations, including the first difference rule. So and other central banks have done that too. I could have mentioned together with Andy Levin, right, we were at the Fed in 95, 96, and started doing the rules memos. Anyway, so the rule delivered a number of useful signals, that was already pointed out, but looking at the period before the financial crisis, you see the first circle. Basically, they signaled that policy should have been tightened earlier, which may have contained at least somewhat the housing boom. After the financial crisis, they called for negative rates to different degrees. I mean, Janet Yellen's emphasis on the balanced approach rule called for even more negative rules, but you could take it as a case for quantitative easing. And from 2014, 2015 onwards, they actually called for an earlier tightening. So the only rule calling for lower for longer was the price level gap rule. And that was dropped from the menu. If you look post-corona, it would be calling now for a lot of higher for longer, right? But anyway, so that brings me to the current situation. Here is from the most recent Fed's report. I think it was a great idea to bring the rules back into the report. I think there was a brief period when they were not in there. So what's the main message? Well, if you look here, there is a huge output gap in 2020. It's huge. I mean, it pushes the rule to minus 18. So it's like saying, I mean, the Taylor rule not quite. The Taylor rule to minus 9, but the balanced approach to double, minus 18. So it's like saying, alarm, super alarm, throw the kitchen sink at the economy, right? And we did, or the decision makers did. We had huge fiscal interventions, and these fiscal interventions were essentially money financed, right? The governments issued debt, but central banks in the major jurisdictions basically bought up that government debt and increased their balance sheet. So it's really a money financed stimulus. And the second, I'll come back to that, but the second point is really here, 2021-22 inflation surge, and it was already said, the message from the rules is the Taylor principle. You need to tighten faster than inflation rises, at least than expectations rise, or at least perceivably in the longer run. So, but let's come back to this gap. This seems like huge. Is that really the message? So my question is, and this is going to be my last point, do they use the right gap in 2020? So just like in the spirit of the original Taylor rule, coming from research, coming from modeling, going to policy practice, I'm going to try to do the same thing. And we've put up a new model database for macro epidemic models. There's this dramatic emergence of new models which involve nonlinear dynamics from epidemics. And one of the contributors, Drabant, is a recent colleague in Goethe. So he basically was instrumental in putting that together. So we're actually taking, so you can find this online. We're actually taking the model of Eichenbaum, Rebello, and Trabant. They have several models. We're taking the one which puts the pandemic into a medium-sized new Keynesian DSGE model. And it will actually have the Taylor rule in there. And it actually will be solved because it's nonlinear. It will be solved, or it is solved here with an updated version of the fair Taylor method, which is available in Danar. So what you see here on the right side is basically the pandemic. We put in an initial set of infections, then you have infected people, it rises, eventually the pandemic dies out. The period is weeks, so it's basically roughly a year of pandemic until it's gone. What happens? Basically, when infections rise, people, being worried, and this is without government intervention, which would reinforce it, but people basically are afraid and they don't want to get infected in consumption, which is contact intensive, so consumption declines. And what's important here is to have also the possibility of getting infected at work. So if then, you have long distance, or in Germany, for example, even, one reason it was pretty steep was even car salesmen didn't sell any cars during that first wave, even though shortly afterwards we figured out that you can sell cars without contact with people. But anyway, so that basically means also labor input goes down, investment goes down for that reason in this model. So both consumption and investment go down, and output goes down here about 8%. So it's roughly fit in terms of the size of the pandemic. Now, the interesting element here is that actually inflation doesn't go down very much. Inflation only goes down about 60 basis points. And the Taylor rule in the model says that you should lower interest rates only about a full percentage point. So that model doesn't call for the kitchen sink. There may be good reasons for throwing the kitchen sink, at least, I was in Germany at least commenting at the time to the news, yes, it's a good idea, but we always said don't do it for so long. But anyway, the model and the rule don't say that here. And why is that? Because the relevant output gap is the deviation from the flexible price output gap. Basically, the supply side is responding to the pandemic. And so the relevant output gap for monetary policy is much smaller, only about 1%. So this doesn't call for such a strong multi-action. That's basically because the model accounts for the supply side and the demand side, the effect you get from sticky prices. So the gap is only 1/8 of the GDP decline. So I'm almost done, John. So I'm adjusting the output gap now in the Fed's rule. I'm just doing it, I didn't have the time, I'm just doing it for the Taylor rule and the BA rule, but in the color choice, we made it similar to the Fed's chart. And you see the policy recommendation is quite a bit different, right? So it calls for additional debt purchases, government additional QE. You see it goes negative, but not the minus 18%, not the minus 9%. So I think that's a more reasonable way of using it, at least it's my view. So within that period, we kind of roughly translate the model to the output gap. Of course, that would be in the first year from first quarter of 20 to first quarter of 21. And then you have the rules rising. So then it kind of catches up again with the output gap as it was in the Fed's rule. So that's the first result. Secondly, in terms of the surge of inflation, I think what you see from this model and from the adjusted Taylor rule, the Corona crisis was much less disinflationary than believed at the time. Right? And you saw in the data, it didn't show the data, but actually inflation also only went down about slightly negative. Right? Secondly, policy, and I'm not going to be able to evaluate more, but it was actually much more expansionary than believed at the time. And some people warned about that early, but if you look at an interesting paper by Jordi Galli, which recently came out, he actually puts transfers into a basic new Keynesian model and looks at money versus debt finance transfers. So there basically the policy switches to generating seigniorage to finance the transfers for some period. It's almost like going into, not quite, but almost like going into fiscal dominance. And there he finds that a money-financed transfer has, even under Ricardo equivalence, has pretty big effects. 50 basis points on inflation per % of GDP. So I think that's another model-based argument. And finally, we had the Russian attack on Ukraine, and which, oftentimes in the press, at least in Europe, they talk about it as if this was the only reason for getting 10% inflation. But we had already 6% inflation at the end of 2021. I think the ground was laid by the first two issues, and policy contributed to that. And then, of course, sometimes when you're late, you get punished by history on top of that. So that was bad luck. But that added the fuel to the fire. So my final chart, I made that point already. The Taylor principle really called for raising interest rates. You can see it here. And I also did the kind of projection which Richard showed and which David Papel and colleagues had done. But the projection, so using the SAP forecasts and plug them into the rule to generate a rule interest rate forecast. But I'm not doing it with partial adjustment. I'm doing it with the actual rule. And what's interesting, it's really coming down pretty fast. Should that be a sign that the Fed's done and they can stop? I'm not so sure, because behind that, of course, is the view that both the equilibrium nominal rate is 2.5%, right? So 0.5 on the real rate. So if you believe that, yes. But if you're a little, skeptical, I want to say, well, let's worry. Then maybe that may be too fast. And also the unemployment gap actually goes the other way in the forecast. Unemployment is going to be above U star. But anyway, that's at the end with my application. Thank you for your time. John, let me run over a little bit. Thank you.
That's great. So we have time for questions. Important rule for the entire rest of the day: identify yourself when you ask a question, because otherwise it's very hard for us afterwards to figure out who asked what. And I think what we'll do is we'll take 3 and then quick responses in order that everyone gets a chance in. And your job is to attract the lady with the microphone, and I'll give the question to whoever can get the microphone first. David Papel, I know. Oh, Harold, go.
Well, I was the last to raise my hand, but thank you very much for the microphone. Harold Uhlig from the University of Chicago. I thought the charts that Volker and Richard put up, in particular, on the relationship between the Taylor rule and the federal funds rate now is very interesting. I mean, if one does a back-of-the-envelope calculation, right, inflation is at 5%. And the federal funds rate is around 5%. So right now the real rate is around 0, and that strikes me as being considerably below the federal funds rate on a sort of back of the envelope calculation. Now one can do interest rate smoothing as you showed, Richard. But Volker came up with a much higher number. Now of course if one follows a much higher number, I can see inflation coming down, therefore the nominal interest rates coming down. But I'm wondering whether in order to get back on track we need to first raise the federal funds rate considerably more than where we are currently at. It looks to me like the Taylor rule tells us that we ought to do that.
David Papel. I'd like to highlight differences between, on one hand, inertial and non-inertial rules, and on the other hand, Taylor rules and balanced approach rules. And as you could see with both Rich Clarida's showing on things with the inertial rules and Volker's real and showing with the non-inertial rules, there's not much difference between Taylor and balanced approach. Now that wasn't always true. That was the entire story after 2009, but that's true now. When you think now, so the whole action now is really non-inertial versus inertial. And just two numbers, if you look at March 2022, when we had liftoff, with the inertial rule, the Taylor rule would have 200 basis points above the actual federal funds rate, the inertial. The non-inertial is 800 basis points above. And that's even true, that big difference goes through December 2022. And you look at the SCP things in there, you still have a big gap through it, maybe 600 basis points instead of 800, but big gap. It's completely gone now. If you look now, that basically you look at what Rich showed and where you're basically at the Taylor rule and projected to be out at the Taylor rule through 2025. You look at the non-inertial rule, we're just about there yet, maybe a quarter to go, and actually the Taylor rule prescriptions go under the federal funds rate projections for 2024 and 2025, but they're much closer than they have been.
So pass the mic to Sebastian, let's take responses quickly, because we have current policy, 2 issues. The real rates are still negative. Why is inflation going down? And accounting for where is the Fed in real time, inertial versus non-inertial. Who wants to take that?
I'll be very quick. The practice is typically to think about policy options in the inertial space, both because that describes past history pretty well. That was my work 20 years ago. And also it has some desirable properties in a lot of models because you basically get the bond market to do your work for you. But you're right. It makes a big difference initially in terms of the gap. How far behind the curve is crucially dependent on what is the benchmark rule. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I think, as Harald said, I mean, we're basically, if you use an ex-post short-term real interest rate, we're just at zero, so that doesn't seem like that much, and it would call for raising them more. If you instead plug in the near-term inflation forecast, I mean, market-based or the Fed's, they've come down, so then you're in positive territory. So if you take the Taylor principle with respect to expectations. But I mean, in the terms of risk management, I would lean towards, rather, or that's what I'm saying when I'm asked is, the bigger risk right now is not to have this come down. And I think the relevant point is core inflation. So core inflation is about 5.5%. And also in Europe, in the euro area, it's about 5.5%. Their inflation is higher. But the difference between the US, and there are two differences which I wanted to mention between US and euro area. One is inflation is still higher. I mean, overall inflation is still higher in the euro area. And core inflation in the euro area hasn't declined.
Right.
So that's been stuck. In the US, there has been some decline and some stagnation in core inflation. So I think right now policymakers should really look at core inflation. And in that respect, when I'm in Frankfurt, I keep referring to the Fed positively because the ECB is still at 3.25%. And there you also have 5.5% core inflation. And now with the banking situation, it's harder to raise rates. So they're even further behind. They definitely shouldn't be talking about pausing, in my view, and need to get up to 4 or 5%. But for now, and maybe if I can mention this, I also have another chart which I didn't include here, but trying to compare the current situation and 73, kind of aligning the attack on Ukraine with the Yom Kippur War, right? The attack on Israel and the oil embargo. When you do that, you find that in the period before the start of the war, it's much more expansionary now, because in 2021, inflation was rising, interest rates were constant, so the real rate is becoming more expansionary. But then with 2022, there's a very, very sharp rise of the nominal rate, which brings it back to at least zero real rate. And so in that sense, that's the positive element of that chart. Policy is much more reactive, not in terms of level, but in terms of the steepness than in 73, 74, when basically, at least in the US, it started sliding in real terms. So.
Sebastian Edwards, that was very interesting. I assign a number of John's works to my students, and every year since 2009, the piece they like the most is a little book called Getting Off Track. So John was worrying about that since that time, and the famous graph that shows that the Fed got behind the curve, and that generated the construction boom and made the crisis much worse. But then Greenspan went out and said, well, that's the conundrum. And we did hike rates eventually, and nothing happened to the 10-year rate, which is really the one that matters as a transmission mechanism. So many people, and many of my students at the time were saying, well, maybe the Taylor rule is still a nice rule, but since there is a conundrum, which is here to stay because of the saving gluts or whatever, the Taylor rule has lost its power. And now we see that the rate has gone up by the federal funds rate by almost as much as at that time, 500 basis points. And there's no conundrum. The 10-year has gone up by 300 basis points, right? So what's the difference between now and then, and why was... So that's what I think it's an interesting question, and I will take advantage of this great panel to have maybe some comments on that.
All right, go ahead.
So I'm Andrew Levin from
and
Dartmouth.
then we'll do this side of the room.
From Dartmouth College. I just wanted to add a couple facts to really great comments that each of you made. So first of all, John Cochran was mentioning Google citations. I think what marks a really remarkable, monumental work is the point at which people don't even bother to include the citations. It's sufficient to simply say the Taylor rule, and everyone knows what you're talking about. You don't bother anymore to put in the Carnegie Rothschild. Okay, so one proof of that was in 2007, I think there was a conference at the Dallas Fed. Don Cohn, who was at the time the vice chair of the Federal Reserve, gave a talk. It's called Taylor Rules Rule. Great talk, you should look it up. And at the time we counted Google citations, like if you do a web search, and the web search for the Taylor rule phrase was in the tens of millions. Now we're like 15 years later. I'm guessing the number is probably billions and billions, kind of like McDonald's burgers. But so I think that would be a better measure now of the kind of the monumental importance. The second thing I just checked on because Google now has this thing called Trends, where you can look at trends in Google searches. And what's amazing is the trend for the Taylor rule is at its all-time high. Okay, you can see it has cycles. They're probably connected to the cycles we've been discussing here about, time. But the point is, and I think that's really remarkable, because there has been Nobel Prize-winning work that was very influential for a decade or two and then kind of faded away. And I think what's remarkable about John Taylor's work is, going back to what Volcker said, I think, the work that John Taylor did in the late 70s and early 80s is still monumentally important here now, 45 years later. It's just amazing. Now, the third fact I wanted to mention, coming to John Lipsky's comments, was the business card. And I was surprised you didn't mention it. Because I remember, I was a young economist at the time, so John Taylor had the Stanford business card office add the Taylor rule to the back of his business cards. And so every time he would meet with people in the private sector, he'd have them flip over the card, and then he would give a 2-3 minute explanation of the Taylor rule. And my impression was that actually that was a big part of how it kind of spread quickly. And maybe the fact that we don't have business cards anymore is kind of a loss, but it seemed to me that was an important anecdote that should be remembered in the history of the Taylor rule.
So we'll go to Chris, and then I have to promise this side of the room equal treatment. And while you're going back with the microphone.
Chris Ursing, really interesting panel. So there's a lot of interest in how monetary policy should respond to financial conditions. So last fall, we saw that financial conditions eased despite very tight monetary policy, somewhat quizzically, and subsequently have seen some tightening of financial conditions, especially in the last couple of months. So with that in mind, I was wondering about your perspectives on a spread-adjusted Taylor rule. So the difference would be that relative to original Taylor rule, monetary policy, if financial conditions tightened and credit spreads rose, would ease essentially preemptively in order to insulate output and inflation from the shock. Thanks.
So while the mic makes it over to that side of the room, guys, I would summarize. We got a conundrum. We got, should Taylor rules pay attention to interest rates with long-term interest rates or interest rates with default spreads in them, which of course are what we care, and have interest rates lost their power to do much these days? Okay.
I'll jump in quickly. Excellent points, as have many of you thought a lot about them. I get nervous, and especially after my time at the Fed, I get nervous in getting too high frequency on the R stars, because in some of my Woodford models, R star changes every second, right? So I like to have, in my own mind, think of an anchor both for communication. I do agree that you can't take a stand on a neutral policy rate, even in steady state, unless you have a view on the equilibrium term premium, because no one borrows at the funds rate except people who shouldn't, right? But everybody who borrows at 5-10 years. And so, I would get nervous about, the term premium moved today, let's change policy. But having a view of what is the steady state anchor, you do, and then that gets into the conundrum situation, right? So the conundrum was, we did this on the funds rate, but the steady state term premium is lower. And I think that is relevant to me. You want to put it in a real model, but in some sense, as a steady state condition, if the term premium is higher, you can get by with a shorter riskless short rate because the term premium is doing some of your work, and vice versa. One thing with the unexpected inflation, it's a little bit easier than it was when we started. There is a TIPS market. 2-year real rate interest rates on a TIP now are 1.8%. So yeah, Michigan survey of professional forecasters. But you can start with market-based real rates, and they're 1.8% right now. So
Over here, anyone got a question?
Hi, Brian Sack. Not employed at the moment. So I want to ask a question, and it's been covered a little bit, but understanding, the advantages of the Taylor rule are its simplicity and its robustness. But if you could choose one variable to add to your policy rule, I'm curious what it would be. And I think some of the other questions maybe provide some potential answers. Sebastian, maybe it's term premium or longer term interest rates. Chris, maybe it's a financial conditions index type measure, but just more broadly, are those what you would add, or would you add something else?
I just wanted to add a few reflections, and then second the question about credit conditions, or ask you to go a little bit deeper in that. But I was really appreciative of his former students talking about his intellectual history, because the Taylor rule didn't come out of nothing. Actually, John's thesis advisor was T.W. Anderson, a very famous time series statistician who also taught in economics. And so from early on, he was interested in this interaction of econometric estimation, dynamic model solution, policy evaluation. I think it's also worth mentioning that he had an association with Alan Greenspan when he was in New York, and had conversations with him. He had long conversations with Milton, and which turned into arguments about what the proper rule was, and so on. He also wrote a very important chapter in the economic report of the president when he was on a council, which is, I understand it was the first mention that monetary policy should be rules-based. That was the formulation we came up with, which was basically whether it was a specific rule, but it should be anchored in a rule. And we got a lot of feedback from the Fed when we circulated a chapter, which wasn't so complimentary, but we did it anyway. I then go on to add, he wrote a very prominent principles book and started teaching simple macroeconomics in Econ 1 with an embedded monetary policy rule. And I think that was really, really important, because most of macroeconomics was done, here's what's going on, now the Fed will do something. There was no interaction at all. And I thought that was really important. I've used that book when I've taught Econ 1 some years ago, and it was, I think, a big teaching breakthrough. There are many things I could go on about, but I think it's really important to emphasize that this has been a continuum, and the Taylor rule, as tremendously important as it is, and by the way, is deserving of a Nobel Prize. For those of you who get that nomination form in the fall, I'll invite you to join me, although I probably just violated a rule and may get excluded now by doing that. I think it's important to realize what he's done continuing in that, and continues to teach, continues to do research. The one part I want to emphasize that hasn't been mentioned, coming primarily from the fiscal side myself, is that John Cogan and Volcker wrote an important paper that a remarkable property. In real time, they estimated the government expenditure multiplier from coming out of the 2009 stimulus. And it's exactly the number that Valerie Ramey came up with in an exhaustive meta-analysis of all the research that had been done for 15 years following what she called the renaissance of fiscal research. So they nailed it in real time, which is very, very impressive.
Thank you, Mike. I guess we have to close, so you get lightning round. If you get to add one variable to the Taylor rule, which would it be? And the none is also an acceptable answer.
Yes. Well, first, I think it does make sense to look at these first difference rules, even if they're not as robust. So that would be adding the lagged interest rate, because if you do that, then you don't need the R star. And we found out the R star, it can also, the views of where the long-run equilibrium is can diverge quite a lot and can also lead you off track. And no.
My answer is none, but two things. First, apologies, I didn't mention the card. But I think really the big point is that the idea was so powerful and so useful, and it became, everybody started asking each other to use it as a benchmark, And it's incredible to see how rapidly it's spread, really on the power of its usefulness. I'd just like to add, I think we're still grappling with the how to interpret the effects of the imposed economic shutdown of the pandemic. And I would say right now, goods prices in the U.S. are increasing on the margin less than 2%. Rents, a problematic measure. We know it's backward looking. If anybody's in the market, they know that currently prices in houses are going down, not up. The crux of the matter right now is to try to understand the data of the labor market, which we still have seen a decline of labor share of GDP until the very latest measures, and think it's very hard to interpret. And clearly, the tips suggest that that market interpretation is that that's going to fade away. That wage pressures are going to fade away essentially on their own, and most people, I think most analysts, don't agree with that, and hence the conundrum.
That's terrific, Rich.
I'll shake it up. I would drop a variable. It's so hard to measure potential output. It can lead to such mischief. Clarida Gallagher, 2001, said you can do very well. Just focus on getting R-star right and getting inflation right. Ballard and Mitra have run all their simulations, and you get very good results just dropping. Look, if we knew the output gap, of course you put it in. But we don't. And as I said, it can lead to mischief. So I'd just drop it.
Inflation target. All right. With that, thank you very much. We're on to the next panel.
Thank you.